From New York, this is Democracy Now!
Build this country with the same happiness that we built it when we governed this country. My dream isn't to solve my problems. Today, I'm a guy that doesn't have a job, president without a pension, not even a television in my apartment. My life is totally blocked. The only thing I'm certain of is that I have more courage to fight than ever before.
After 19 months behind bars, former Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva is released from prison. He's vowing to challenge Brazil's far-right president, Jair Bolsonaro. We'll speak to Petra Costa, director of the new documentary, The Edge of Democracy. Then we go to California to speak with San Francisco's newly elected district attorney, Chesa Boudin, who won despite the Police Officers Association spending over $650,000 on ads attacking him.
Being a progressive prosecutor, Amy, is not just about decarceration, reducing racial disparities, and so on. It's also about making sure we are using the tremendous power and discretion of the district attorney's office to enforce the laws equally. That means prosecuting corporate landlords when they commit fraud. It means prosecuting police when they commit murder or perjury. It means prosecuting corporations when they dump toxic waste into our communities.
Then to Seattle, where a group of progressive city councilors were able to beat back a $1.4 million campaign by Amazon to flip the city council. We'll speak to Seattle's Socialist City Council member, Kshama Sawant.
It's like our movement has won. And defended our socialist city council seat for working people against the richest man in the world.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Longtime Bolivian President Evo Morales has departed Bolivia for Mexico after stepping down Sunday in what he calls a military coup. Late Monday, Morales departed La Paz on a Mexican government plane. He's been granted asylum in Mexico. He announced his resignation Sunday shortly after the Bolivian military took to the airwaves to call for his departure. Last month, Morales was re-elected for a fourth term in a race his opponents claimed was marred by fraud. Morales' departure has sparked outrage and protests across Latin America, with many saying he was the victim of a military coup. This is Danielle Menendez in Argentina.
There have been enormous advances in all social indicators in Bolivia in the past 14 years that bother the privileged sectors, that hydrocarbons have been nationalized, that basic income has been increased for the entire population. Despite all this, a minority, together with the armed forces, are carrying out this outrage, this barbarity that has to do with a coup, and policies that we thought had been eradicated from the region, and that is why it is so important that popular movements throughout Latin America come out to repudiate this coup.
Evo Morales was Bolivia's first indigenous president. On Monday, videos circulated of Morales' opponents burning Wipila indigenous flags. Morales' departure came a week after Bolivia's government canceled a massive multinational lithium mining project slated for Bolivia's southern highlands. To see our coverage of the political crisis in Bolivia, go to democracynow.org. In immigration news, the Supreme Court will begin to hear oral arguments today on 3 lawsuits demanding the Trump administration preserve DACA. That's Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, the Obama-era program that grants protection from deportation and a work permit to at least 700,000 undocumented people brought to the United States as children. This is 31-year-old DACA recipient Maricruz Abarca.
If the Supreme Court doesn't go in favor of DACA, basically it's going to be just, for me personally, it's just going to be an end. It's like I'm just going to go back to shadows and, not continue my education, pursuing my dream to become a criminal lawyer. The future of thousands of dreamers, and not only dreamers, but American U.S. citizens, are basically in their hands. It's like we are we are just right there in the limbo, not knowing what's going to happen with our lives.
On Capitol Hill, televised impeachment hearings are slated to begin Wednesday into the inquiry into whether President Trump withheld military aid from Ukraine to pressure the Ukrainian president to investigate Trump's political rival, Joe Biden, and his son. It's only the third time in U.S. history there have been televised impeachment hearings. On Wednesday, the first two witnesses to testify will be George Kent, a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, and Bill Taylor, a former ambassador and the top U.S. diplomat in Ukraine. Former Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick may jump into the 2020 presidential race. The New York Times reports the two-term governor has spoken to Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden and Democratic officials and is considering announcing his plans to run later this week. Deval is managing director at the private equity firm Bain Capital, which was co-founded by Republican Utah Senator Mitt Romney. Here in New York, longtime Republican Congressmember Peter King has announced his retirement. King is the 14-term representative from Long Island. Progressive lawmakers celebrated his announcement that he would not seek election in 2020. Among them, Minnesota Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, who tweeted, quote, "Peter King is an Islamophobe who held McCarthyite hearings targeting American Muslims, said there are too many mosques in this country, and blamed Eric Garner for his own death at the hands of police. Good riddance," Congressmember Ilhan Omar tweeted. In Los Angeles, Donald Trump Jr. was heckled off stage during a talk by his own supporters who erupted in protest after he announced he would not be taking questions. President Trump's son was at UCLA, the University of California's Los Angeles campus, Sunday to promote his book, Triggered: How the Left Thrives on Hate and Wants to Silence Us. But it turned out to be his own right-wing fans who ended up silencing and driving the author off stage with hostile chants of Q&A, Q&A, to the tune of USA, USA, after Trump Jr. said there would not be enough time for audience questions. The Environmental Protection Agency plans to restrict the scientific research that the federal government uses to write new public health regulations. That's according to the New York Times, which obtained a draft of new EPA proposals that stipulate scientists would have to disclose their raw data, including confidential medical records, in order for the EPA to even consider an academic study's conclusions. Scientists say these measures would make it far more difficult for the agency to issue new clean air and water rules. The Israeli military bombed the home of a senior member of the Palestinian group Islamic Jihad before dawn in Gaza today, killing the commander, Baha Abu Elata, and his wife Asma, and injuring their children. Following the targeted assassination, over 50 rockets were fired from Gaza into Israel, injuring at least one civilian. The European Union has condemned the rocket attack, saying, quote, "The firing of rockets on civilian populations is totally unacceptable and must immediately stop." The Afghan government and the Taliban have agreed on a prisoner exchange, which Afghan President Ashraf Ghani says aims to facilitate direct peace negotiations. The swap will free American professor Kevin King and Australian professor Timothy Weeks. Both had been professors at the American University of Afghanistan before being kidnapped in Kabul in 2016. In exchange, the Afghan government will free 3 senior Taliban members, Anas Haqqani, Hafiz Rashid, and Haji Mali Khan. The Chilean government has agreed to rewrite its constitution in order to replace the one that was written during Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet's brutal military regime. The rewriting of the constitution has been one of the key demands of the massive demonstrations that have rocked Chile in recent weeks. The Chilean authorities have killed at least 19 people and wounded thousands more since the protests erupted on October 19th in response to a subway fare hike and quickly grew into a revolt against austerity and economic inequality. Over 260 people were arrested in Hong Kong Monday amidst escalating clashes between pro-democracy student protesters and police. Some schools and universities across Hong Kong are closed today as demonstrations continue across the territory. Over 3,000 people have been arrested since the protests broke out in June. In Arizona, activist Scott Warren of the group No More Deaths is heading back to court for a second trial today for providing water, food, clean clothes and beds to two undocumented migrants crossing the Sonoran Desert in southern Arizona. Warren's been indicted on felony conspiring to harbor. If convicted, he could spend up to 10 years in prison. A jury deadlocked after his first trial 5 months ago. In August, Democracy Now! Accompanied Scott Warren into the Sonoran Desert of Arizona as he accompanied other activists dropping food and water for migrants attempting the deadly crossing. This is Scott Warren.
So there's the direct impact on people who have died, people who have suffered out here, people who have been disappeared, and then the ripple effects of their families. The trauma that creates, the traumatic experience of this is another way that it can feel like a conflict or like a war zone. I don't like the war zone rhetoric that you typically hear politicians use because it's deployed to increase militarization and building of walls. But it's appropriate when we think about the trauma that people have faced as they cross through these areas and the trauma that their families experience and the pain.
Former President Jimmy Carter is scheduled to undergo an operation today to relieve pressure on his brain. The 95-year-old was hospitalized Monday evening at Emory University Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. The Carter Center said the procedure is needed due to bleeding due to his recent falls. Carter suffered a minor pelvic fracture from a fall last month and broke his hip in a separate fall in May and got stitches in his head as well. Until just a few weeks ago, he was continuing to build homes for his project Habitat for Humanity. And in Texas, the father of Tatiana Jefferson has died less than 1 month after a police officer killed his 28-year-old daughter by shooting through the bedroom window of her own home in a case that sparked national protest over the treatment of African-American women at the hands of police. On Saturday, Tatiana's father, Marquise Jefferson, died after suffering a heart attack. The family spokesperson said, quote, "I can only sum it up as a broken heart." Tatiana was his only child. She was killed exactly 1 month ago on October 12th by white police officer Aaron Dean, who was responding to a non-emergency wellness check called for by a neighbor who noticed that Tatiana had left her front door open. Dean has been charged with murder. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world. We begin today's show in Brazil, where former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva was freed from prison Friday after 580 days behind bars. Lula's surprise release came after the Brazilian Supreme Court ruled to end the mandatory imprisonment of people convicted of crimes who are still appealing their cases. Lula has vowed to challenge Brazil's right-wing President Jair Bolsonaro in the 2022 elections. During a rally on Friday, soon after his release, Lula warned about Bolsonaro's ties to violent militias.
Was democratically elected. We accept the result of the election. This guy has a mandate for 4 years. Now he was elected to govern the Brazilian people and not to govern the militia in Rio de Janeiro. I want to build this country with the same happiness that we built it when we governed this country. My dream isn't to solve my problems. Today, I'm a guy that doesn't have a job, president without a pension, not even a television in my apartment. My life is totally blocked. The only thing I'm certain of is that I have more courage to fight than ever before.
Lula was serving a 12-year sentence over a disputed corruption and money laundering conviction handed down by conservative judge Sergio Moro, an ally of current far-right Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro. After that, he became the justice minister. Lula has long maintained his innocence. Earlier this year, The Intercept revealed Moro aided prosecutors in their sweeping corruption investigation known as Operation Car Wash in an attempt to prevent Lula from running in the 2018 election. This cleared the path for Bolsonaro's victory. At the time of his imprisonment in April 2018, Lula was leading the presidential polls. Well, for more, we're joined by the Brazilian filmmaker Petra Costa. Her new documentary, The Edge of Democracy, chronicles the imprisonment of Lula, the impeachment of former President Dilma Rousseff, and the story of the dictatorship and the democracy about the same age as our guest, the Brazilian filmmaker Petra Costa. Welcome back to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us, Petra. We last saw you right before Lula was released. It was a total shock. Can you respond?
Yes, I was very moved by his release, but also very worried because the abuse of law in Brazil has been so consistent over the last 5 years that it's hard to know how long this decision will last. It's a very necessary decision that goes back to our Constitution in '88, which says that anyone has the right to exhaust their appeals before they are imprisoned. That was revised in 2016 due to large pressures of Operation Car Wash, the corruption investigation led by Judge Moro. And now the Supreme Court, I believe, influenced by the revelations of the leak that happened earlier this year, which showed how politicized the operation possibly was, decided to come back to the Constitution and grant Lula his constitutional right as well as other Brazilians.
Yeah, I was going to ask you precisely that given the revelations that have come out about the tainted nature of his actual conviction, that this possibly could have been the easier way for the Supreme Court to go than to actually overturn his original conviction and call the entire current government into question because Sergio Moro now is the justice minister, right?
Yes, we are waiting for another ruling that the Supreme Court should do soon, which will decide whether the trial and the judge were actually impartial or not. If that is decided, that he was not impartial, then all the process falls, which means that Lula could even run for president in 2022. Because basically what the leak showed, as Amy mentioned, was that there's a possibility that the judge was coordinating every action of the prosecutors, influencing just before the election whether Lula could be a candidate or not. Lula was not allowed to be a candidate, and if it was done differently, it was possible that he would be president at this moment.
And explain who Moro was in the trial and who he is today.
Moro was the judge responsible for overseeing Car Wash operation. Today, he is Justice Minister of Bolsonaro with, it's called Super Justice Minister, with more than just the Justice Ministry, but other ministries under his watch. Was
that seen as a reward by Bolsonaro to Moro for imprisoning his opponent? Lula, of course, the poll showed he was far ahead in the race for president in 2018.
Exactly. Many see it as a reward.
Now, are there any other people who are in jail who will also be released as a result of this ruling?
Yes.
Are some of them who are?
José Dirceu, I believe, and about 200 from Car Wash, and also people who have committed petty crimes. And Brazil has the third largest incarcerated population in the world. It's a huge crisis, as similar to the United States. And we need an urgent judiciary, like prison reform and judiciary reform, that will make our judiciary system more efficient. I think the mistake that many people fall into is thinking that constitutional rights can be abused to have a more efficient system. The danger with that is that today Lula's constitutional rights can be abused, tomorrow mine, tomorrow yours, and where do we stand as a democracy?
I want to go to a clip in your film, The Edge of Democracy. This is former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva giving his farewell speech to the people on his way to prison in
Eles
they
decretaram
They ordered my arrest. It's no use trying to stop me from traveling around this country. Because there are millions of Lulas, Bulas, Manuelas, and Dilma Rousseffs to do it for me. There's no use in trying to stop my ideas. They're already in the air, and you can't imprison them. There's no point in trying to stop my dreams. Because when I stop dreaming, I'll be dreaming through your minds and dreams. There's no point in thinking everything's going to stop the day Lula has a heart attack. That's nonsense, because my heart will be beating through yours. And there are millions of hearts. The powerful can kill 1, 2, or 100 roses. But they'll never stop the arrival of spring, and our fight is in search of spring.
That is Lula, right before he went to jail. Now, Petra Costa, what is amazing about your film is that you are right there with him. Talk about the moments before he turned himself in. You didn't know what he wanted to, or maybe more significantly, he didn't know what he was going to do.
Exactly. Once his prison was declared, and he immediately said that he was going to go to the syndicate, the union, where he started his political career in the 80s. So everyone went there, and I went with my camera, not knowing if I would be able to get in, and slowly I managed to get access. And we were there for 3 days, kind of hostage inside that workers' union. He had no idea. Every moment someone would come and say he decided not to give himself in, he's giving himself in. And until the last moment, he did not know until he decided to give himself in. And when he declared that decision, the crowd surrounded the union and started to try to prevent him from giving himself in, holding the doors and the gates, not allowing for the police to enter or for Lula to leave. It was one of the most dramatic things I've ever seen in my life.
And why did he decide to turn himself in?
Because he believed it was necessary for him to abide by the Constitution, abide by the rule of law, to expose whether he was having a fair trial or not.
Let's go to the clip that really conveys this moment. We're going to try to go to that clip that conveys that incredibly powerful moment where Lula... Where was he, by the way?
It's the workers' union where he started his career in the interior of São Paulo, São Bernardo.
So we're going to see if we have that clip.
For the climax of Car Wash, Moro authorizes the police to detain Lula and force him to testify, even though the former president had never resisted questioning. Suspecting Lula was involved in the corruption scheme, investigators look for evidence. An apartment, allegedly gifted to him by a construction company, implicated in the car wash scandal. Although there's no formal accusation, the spectacle of Lula being taken by force by the police creates an impression of guilt.
That wasn't the moment that he was deciding whether to go to jail, but explain what it was, Petra Costa.
This is early 2016 when Judge Moro declares that Lula should be taken in an enforced coercion, which is basically meant taking him to an enforced interrogation, which many said at the time was unconstitutional because Lula had volunteered to speak, and many didn't know at the time if he would be imprisoned or not immediately after this interrogation. It would still take 2 years for him to be imprisoned.
And tell us a little bit about how you got started with this film, why you decided to make it. You're relatively young for the leaders of this movement, covering this movement, how you got involved.
Well, I grew up believing that democracy was my birthright, guaranteed from a lifetime of my parents' struggle. My parents fought against the military dictatorship and dedicated their lives to kind of establish democracy in Brazil. And when I was born was more or less at the same time as Brazilian democracy. And as I was growing up, I kind of took it for granted. I thought it was a given. Until in 2016, it started to become clear to me that that was not the case. For many reasons. One of them was the first time I took the camera was to film a protest asking for Dilma's impeachment. And I filmed the streets of Rio with thousands of people asking for Dilma's impeachment, but some asking for the return of the military that had killed hundreds and tortured thousands in Brazil. And I never thought I would see people asking for the return of that regime. So it was clear to me that a neurosis was boiling in Brazilian soil, and I wanted to understand where it was coming from and where it was heading. And that's when I embarked in this journey that took 1,001 days.
So let's turn to the trailer of your film, Petra, The Edge of Democracy.
Brazilian democracy and I are almost the same age. I thought that in our 30s, we would both be standing on solid ground.
Petra, for the first time voting in the historical election.
I was 19 when Lula got elected. I remember the excitement. It felt like a huge step in our democratic path. 20 million people leaving poverty. Unemployment reached the lowest number in history, and Brazil rises as a major player on the world stage.
The most popular politician on earth.
To succeed him, he chooses Dilma Rousseff, who becomes our first female president.
Todos nós seremos julgados pela história.
It felt like a change of symbols. But something in our social fabric started to change. The country divided into two parts. And this wall would rip us apart. The party is soon caught in a corruption scandal, the greatest investigation in the country's history.
O que vão pensar de nós?
Mas o arrependimento eu tenho que ter feito mais.
Crimes include fraud, slavery, even homicide.
One president impeached, another in prison. Our democracy is crumbling.
Essa farsa sexista. Estou cada dia mais vivo perante a opinião pública.
I fear our democracy was nothing but a short-lived dream.
The trailer to your film, The Edge of Democracy. I wanted to ask you in terms of the current situation with we're seeing in Bolivia, we're seeing the continued conflicts in Venezuela. One of the, I guess, hallmarks of Lula's approach to social change as leadership is that he served his terms and then left office and passed it on to a successor. Whereas in Bolivia, Evo Morales has attempted to stay for a fourth term, and in Venezuela with Chavez as well, seeking to overturn term limits. This whole issue of succession in a movement and passing the baton on to other leaders. Wondering your sense of Lula's impact by making that decision.
I think it was essential, and he deserves a lot of respect for his decision. Lula and Dilma as well were very Republican in the sense of the word, that they respected the institutions in Brazil and the equilibrium of the three powers, and it should be seen as an example for other countries in a moment where that is becoming less and less. I think we're seeing an abuse of the institutions, an abuse of the Constitution, where some are like putting it on the ground to stay in power for longer and to destroy their enemies. That is happening in the United States as well as in many places around the world.
And since we last saw you as you presented your film that's now on Netflix in New York, yet another, in fact, several environmental activists, indigenous leaders in the Amazon have been murdered. Talk about the connection between that, the far-right President Jair Bolsonaro, and Lula's imprisonment and what it could mean now that he's free.
That's very serious. The indigenous leader Paulo Paulino was assassinated, and many killings have been happening in Brazil by the police and by militias, and in the Amazon by loggers and miners. And it's part of, I believe, an advance of a savage, unregulated capitalism that is seeking profit for all costs. And I think what we need, international attention is essential in this case in Brazil. It helped a few months ago with the question of the Amazon, which had a 90% increase in deforestation compared to the previous year. And who is paying the check for the impeachment and Lula's? Who is actually gaining from the impeachment that happened in Brazil and Lula's imprisonment? There are big corporations that are taking huge profit out of this.
And could you talk a little about the change between the Lula and Dilma eras and Bolsonaro in terms of the day-to-day lives of working people, of the racial minorities, and of women
yes.
in Brazil?
The economic crisis started with Dilma Rousseff. There was a huge stagnation and a huge crisis and augmentation of unemployment then, but it continues to rise immensely. Now there are now 13 million Brazilians under the poverty line, and in the question of women, it's far worse. I think since the election, there has been a huge spike in violence and feminicide and rapes. And in killings of people by the police, that is the most absurd. There has been a 20% increase in killings in Rio, just in Rio. And Rio de Janeiro has more people killed by the police than the entire United States. 5 people are killed per day. And that has been incentivized by the government, which says that a police that is only a real police if they kill. That is a kind of a state-led genocide that is happening in Brazil at this moment.
Let me ask you about the Brazilian president, Jair Bolsonaro, lashing out at Brazil's largest media company, Globo, after it broadcast a report alleging a link between Bolsonaro and the 2 men accused of murdering the Rio de Janeiro council member, Marielle Franco, in March of last year. Globo quoted a doorman who said one of the murder suspects, the alleged getaway driver Elcio de Queiroz, arrived at Bolsonaro's gated community on the night of the murder and was granted access after calling Bolsonaro's residence. De Queiroz then drove to the home of the second suspect in the murder, the alleged triggerman, Rani Lessa, who has a residence in the same area. His railing against Globo, he did when he was in Saudi Arabia in this meeting they had with, Bolsonaro, Mohammed bin Salman, Jared Kushner and others, what was called Davos in the desert. And he just railed for many, many minutes on television. Talk about the threats to the press and what this means about the murder of and significance of Marielle Franco.
Well, Marielle Franco was assassinated last year, and there's still investigations into who killed her. Yes, Globo did that report and Bolsonaro railed at them, but there have been consistent attacks to the media that have happened in the last months. And it's very serious and puts real questions into what will happen to Brazilian democracy. There have also been threats of indications that there's a desire to reinstate the Institutional Act number 5, which is the act that determined the closing of the Congress in Brazil and repression of any assembly. And Brazilians, I am extremely fearful of what will happen in Brazil. I think we have to be very attentive. And there's a recent remark by Bannon saying that Lula is the biggest threat to the populist right movement, and that he's the biggest leader of the globalist. Yes, Steve Bannon, and that Lula is the biggest leader of the leftist globalist movement. So I think the world has to pay attention to what will happen to Lula in the next months, because his constitutional rights and his rights to a fair trial are of international interest at this moment.
Well, Petra Costa, congratulations on this deeply moving personal and political film. The film, The Edge of Democracy, out on Netflix. Petra Costa, a filmmaker and actor. When we come back, we go to California to speak with San Francisco's District Attorney-elect, Chesa Boudin, who won despite the Police Officers Association, or some might say because of them, spending over $650,000 on ads against him. Stay with us.
Bamboleio que faz gingar, Brasil do meu amor, terra de nosso Senhor, Brasil, Brasil. Pra mim, oh, abre a cortina do passado, tira a mãe preta do cerrado, bota o rei Congo no congado, deixa cantar de novo trovador, a merencória luz da lua, toda canção.
Caetano Veloso performing Brazil at Columbia University last month. He was on a panel talking about The Edge of Democracy, the new Netflix film. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, in a stunning victory, public defender Chesa Boudin has been declared the winner of a hotly contested district attorney's race in San Francisco. Boudin is the child of Weather Underground activists Kathy Boudin and David Gilbert, who were both incarcerated when he was still a toddler. He learned the news that he'd won the race by a razor-thin margin while he was on a plane flying back from visiting his father, who remains in prison in upstate New York. As of the latest numbers, Boudin had 36% of the vote. His opponent, Susie Loftus, had 31%. Boudin ran on a platform to end cash bail and dismantle the war on drugs. He was endorsed by Democratic presidential candidate Bernie Sanders. His win sends a pointed message to the Democratic establishment, which had mobilized in full force against his campaign. San Francisco Mayor London Breed, California Governor Gavin Newsom, and Senators Dianne Feinstein and Kamala Harris all endorsed Boudin's opponent, Susie Loftus. The mayor even named Loftus interim district attorney just weeks before the election in a move condemned by the ACLU as an unfair tilting of the scales. The Police Officers Association had also spent up to $650,000 on ads attacking Boudin. Despite this, after 4 days of ballot counting, he was declared the winner.
Chesa Boudin is the newest addition to a growing number of public defenders around the country who vowed to use the district attorney seat to end tough-on-crime tactics and restore civil rights, including District Attorneys Rachel Rollins of Boston, Larry Krasner of Philadelphia. Krasner tweeted, quote, "Americans are more humane and compassionate than institutions created and controlled by the powerful few. Our movement for a truly just system that supports the well-being of all communities has a new technician in Chesa Boudin," Krasner said. Well, Chesa Boudin joins us now from San Francisco, California. Welcome back to Democracy Now! So how does it feel to have won? And talk about when you learned you had actually won.
Well, thank you, Amy. Thank you, Juan. It's great to be back. And, of course, I'm humbled by the support we received, by the outcome of the election, and by the confidence that the voters of San Francisco have put in me and my vision for making the city a safer, more humane place for all of its residents. I was on the middle seat of a coach class ticket on my way back from the East Coast, as Juan said, after a couple days of visiting my father at the maximum security prison where he has lived for the last 38 years. And we had internet on the plane. We checked the Department of Elections website. we saw the news. We saw that it was a margin of victory that was insurmountable given the outstanding ballots left to count. And I was with my fiancée. We did our best to celebrate there on the plane in the cramped quarters that we found ourselves in. And then, we began preparing for what comes next. In many ways, the real work lies ahead of us. We've been given a tremendous amount of responsibility. And with that, comes hard work and the focus of, proving voters right and fulfilling the promises that we made throughout this campaign.
So you're celebrating by getting married Friday?
I am getting married this week. I'm going to be out of the country for a couple weeks. I'm going to put in place a transition team, and we're going to do a lot of listening and a lot of planning. It's imperative that when I take office, we have really detailed plans and a team in place to execute those plans, to make sure the structures and the staff at the district attorney's office are ready to implement the policy vision that the voters elected me to put in place. And that's going to take time. We don't want to make mistakes. We want to move carefully and judiciously. So we're going to be working really hard over the next couple of months to put in place that transition plan, to listen to law enforcement leaders, to community leaders, to merchants, to go around the city and really sit down with every stakeholder we can and make sure their voice is being heard as we go about transforming San Francisco's approach to criminal justice.
And Chesa, could you talk a little bit about the counting process in your election and the impact, let's say, of the campaign against you by the Police Officers Association? Because San Francisco has ranked choice voting, doesn't it? So there was an issue there of how the votes went through each cycle of the counting.
That's right. So there were 4 candidates in the race, and every voter had the choice or the option to put as many as 4 choices in order. Many voters only put their first choice. Some put all 4. Some put less. I was the candidate who had the most first choice votes. I was also the candidate who ended up with more than 50% of the votes after the ranked choice analysis, which basically works as follows. The candidate who gets the least number of first choice votes is eliminated, and all of their ballots which put a second choice then get redistributed. And if no one has 50%, which was the case in this race, the next least vote-getting candidate is eliminated, and the ballots that have a third choice, or in some cases a second choice, are then redistributed to the remaining 2 candidates. That happened in this race, and it took several days of counting to get through enough ballots before I passed the 50% threshold. Part of that is because in San Francisco, a significant majority of voters vote by mail. And ballots can be postmarked as late as Election Day. And so many of the votes that were necessary to be counted didn't even arrive at the Department of Elections until a couple days after the election itself. That process took a few days. We were watching the returns every day eagerly, and we saw the trends, and we realized a couple days ahead of the final outcome that we were very likely to win. And we understood the dynamics in the race and the neighborhoods we needed to have a strong performance in. And I have to say, it was a tremendous testament to people power, to a principled and positive campaign. We made the choice not to do negative attacks, even in the face of the onslaught of dishonest attacks from the Police Officers Association. And I think that strategy, in combination with the real grassroots organizing led by local groups like San Francisco Rising, like the hardworking members of SEIU 1021 and the United Educators of San Francisco and the National Union of Healthcare Workers, all of the groups, community groups and unions that stepped up to support this people-powered campaign, that really made the difference in terms of the outcome.
So it's safe to say that as ranked choice voting moves into major cities, as it's increasingly doing across the country, that we should all expect our elections to take several days, if not weeks, to declare the winners. No more election night declaration of winners now with ranked choice voting, right?
Well, it does depend on the dynamics. This was a particularly close race, 4 first-time political candidates running for the same seat. And also remember that a big part of it is San Francisco's use of vote by mail. I think that if we were a jurisdiction where most voters voted on Election Day, it would probably be a bit faster to process the votes than with vote by mail. But certainly when you have a close race and ranked choice analysis has to be conducted, it can take a few days for sure.
So, Chesa Boudin, talk about this almost unprecedented police effort, attack on you, $650,000 in attack ads, yet you still win. And it might not have been despite that. It might be that infuriated many people and might have turned them in a close race to support you. How do you now deal with the police and also the many communities of San Francisco?
Well, that's right, Amy. You know, the onslaught of attacks all came in about a 10-day period, and the police union spent in that 10 days of attacks pretty much the same amount as my campaign spent over the entire year. So it was a tremendously impactful last-minute onslaught. But you're right that it's hard to say what the impact was. Certainly, there were many, many voters who rejected the attacks. And I think it speaks to the ways in which the leadership of the police union is really disconnected from the values of San Francisco voters. The attacks backfired both because they were dishonest and racist, but also because voters simply didn't want that kind of interference or tone in local politics. And so, you know, it's hard to say specifically whether I won more or less votes because of the attacks. But what is clear is voters rejected the attacks and saw through them. I think, you know, going forward, we have to be mindful of the fact that the police union leadership has been on the wrong side of so many issues and so many races for years in San Francisco politics. There's a real disconnect, as I said. But my job isn't to hold grudges, isn't to attack back, but rather to roll up my sleeves, sit down at the table with everybody who's willing to talk, and be willing to listen to them so we can rebuild the trust between our communities and the law enforcement that's supposed to serve and protect those communities. If you look at the protests, if you look in the eyes of the parents of Alex Nieto and Mario Woods and other people who've been killed by police violence in San Francisco, it is clear that we have a tremendous amount of work to do to rebuild that trust, and I'm committed to doing it with everybody at the table.
And I'm wondering, did you get the normal congratulatory phone calls from all of the other political leaders in the state, Gavin Newsom, the 2 U.S. senators, all of whom are originally from the San Francisco area, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. I did get a number of phone calls. I was on an airplane when the news broke, so I landed and had a very warm voicemail from both Mayor London Breed as well as from my rival candidate and interim district attorney Susie Loftus. I have heard since then from a large number of local leaders. The chief of police were scheduling a meeting, the city attorney, and many others, including people who were on the other side of this campaign. I have not heard from the U.S. senators or the governor yet.
So, Chesa, if you could lay out for us what your plans are right now, what you think are the most serious issues that you want to take on, that you ran on, that really unites you with this new breed of district attorneys around the country.
Well, I do think that this election is a bellwether for what's to come in 2020, and I'm tremendously hopeful that in places like New Orleans and Honolulu and Arizona and Ohio and even right here in Los Angeles in Southern California, we're going to see more people running on progressive reform platforms win. And I think it's a testament to the broad recognition that the tough-on-crime policies of the 1990s and 2000s are not working, and voters are rejecting them across the board. I'm excited to see that. Some of the specific policies, to your question, Amy, include ending money bail. And that's a fight that I've been involved in the courts for going on 5 years now through litigation. I'm excited on day one to be able to put in place a policy that prohibits my staff from ever putting a price tag on freedom. And you know, the problem with money bail, for folks who aren't familiar with it, is that when someone gets arrested under the money bail system, they can buy their way out immediately if they have resources. And that's without regard to their risk or to their community ties. So someone who's really dangerous but has access to wealth can be out of jail and back on the streets within a matter of hours, while another person charged with a less serious crime with weaker evidence against them and stronger ties to the community would languish behind bars simply because of their poverty. It's a system that actually undermines the integrity of the entire criminal justice system. And so when I'm district attorney, we're going to use risk rather than wealth to determine who's incarcerated pretrial. That's one of the policies that I think on day one will make a tremendous difference in restoring trust and integrity to the criminal justice system.
And very quickly, the influence of your four parents, two sets of parents, all were Weather Underground. You have the parents who raised you, Bernadine Dorn and Bill Ayers, and your parents who were behind bars for decades, your mom out now, your father in for life. The influence of growing up yourself, in a sense, behind bars, or at least going back and forth to visit your mother and father.
That's right. I mean, I've spent thousands of days of my life in prison visiting rooms and inside prisons. And, you know, the Weather Underground and that history was all way before I was born. And so I remember it the way that many people of my generation do, through the history books primarily. But what I do remember is going through steel gates and being searched by prison guards and waiting in line at metal detectors just to see my parents, just to give them a hug. And, you know, one of the things that I learned as I began studying these issues is that I'm not alone. There are millions of Americans, millions of children who've grown up in this country who've had to visit their parents behind bars. It turns out that the majority of Americans have an immediate family member who is either currently or formerly incarcerated. So while it's true that in my circles at Yale and at Oxford, as a Rhodes Scholar, my experience of having parents incarcerated made me an outlier, I'm firmly in the majority of Americans in sharing that experience. And I think it's a critical perspective to bring to the difficult job of deciding who to send to prison and for how long. I intend to lead the office of District Attorney with compassion for everyone whose life is touched by the criminal justice system, whether they're children of incarcerated parents, whether they're crime victims or family members of crime victims, or whether they're the people who themselves have committed crimes. We need to lead with compassion, with intelligence, with data-driven and empirically informed policies, and we need to end this approach that relies on jails and prisons as the answer to all of our social problems.
Jason Boudin, I want to thank you for being with us, District Attorney-elect of San Francisco, and happy wedding. When we come back, we'll look at another big election win in Seattle, where a group of progressive city councilors beat back a $1.5 million campaign by Amazon to flip the Seattle City Council. Stay with us.
Haremos el camino en un mismo trazado, uniendo nuestros hombros para así levantar aquellos que cayeron gritando libertad. Habrá un día en que todos al levantar la vista.
Data. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. This is Democracy Now!
We end today's show in Seattle, where a group of progressive city councilors were able to beat back a $1.5 million campaign by Amazon to flip the city council. 7 of the seats on the Seattle City Council were up for grabs in last week's election, which was widely seen as a referendum on Amazon, the city's largest private employer and one of the most powerful companies in the world. 5 candidates backed by Amazon and other business interests lost their bids for council seats. Perhaps the most visible face in the political fight against Amazon is socialist City Council member Kshama Sawant, who has been reelected in a race that pitted her against Amazon-backed candidate Egan Orion. Amazon poured nearly $500,000 into that race alone.
Kshama Sawant is Seattle's first socialist politician elected in nearly a century. She successfully pushed a number of progressive policies, including making Seattle the first major American city to adopt a $15 an hour minimum wage. Kshama Sawant joining us now from Seattle. Welcome back to Democracy Now! Talk about the campaign against you and your progressive slate's victory.
Thank you so much, Amy and Juan, for having this very, very important and indeed absolutely historic event that has happened in Seattle. And as you said, it has been a major repudiation, not only of Amazon and Jeff Bezos himself, you know, as the richest man in the world, but also, it has been a referendum on the vision for Seattle, and I think Seattle is a microcosm for metropolitan areas in general. You know, what should our urban spaces look like? Should our cities be playgrounds for the very wealthy, or should they be places where ordinary people can live and thrive. And I think it is beyond any doubt that the voters in Seattle have spoken that Seattle is not up for sale. Our democratic process in the city, the elections are not up for sale. And it has happened in this dramatic fashion where not only Amazon, Amazon is obviously the most visible player in the attempted sort of hostile corporate takeover that they did this year in this year's election. But it wasn't just Amazon. It was the entire might of the corporate elite, of the capitalist class that we went up against. So it's trillion-dollar corporation Amazon, but also corporate real estate, all the large businesses that fought viciously against $15 an hour 4 years ago, and also the businesses that were completely against the tax on big business that we attempted and then was repealed shamefully by the majority of the city council last year. And so I think that this shows what a tremendous opening there is, not only for the left to seize opportunities, but as you have seen, as a socialist movement, we have a grassroots socialist movement went up against the richest man in the world, and we were able to prevail.
And also, you neglected to mention there the role of the media. The Seattle Times, of course, if you want to talk about their role in terms of this election. And also the fact that the city council had suffered a defeat a year earlier when Amazon effectively forced it to rescind a tax on for affordable housing.
Yes, and in fact, the role of the media is integral to the whole political process under capitalism, and it's diametrically opposite to what you do on Democracy Now!, and that's why it's really, really important that you're covering this analysis here. I mean, just to give you an example, the Seattle Times editorial board, which has been a long-time conservative establishment, pro-big business, and also pro-right-wing ideas, spilled so much ink, not only this year, against my campaign, specifically against my socialist council office, against our movement-building approach. But as you said, Juan, last year, when our movement attempted to bring what we call the Amazon tax, which is a tax on the largest businesses, in order to change what we have as a status quo, which is a corporate tax haven in a city with the nation's most regressive tax system. And the Seattle Times editorial board spilled so much ink spreading lies, distortion, and misinformation about that tax. And then they carried that on this year. And so, while on the one hand, all this corporate money, over $4 million in the corporate PACs that were dumped by all these corporations, by the billionaires, while on the one hand, it has completely backfired and, it showed that, voters are rejecting this kind of attempted takeover. But on the other hand, it also bought them incredible numbers of, attack mailers that were sent to people's mailboxes, endless attack ads on every type of social media and other media, and then of course the corporate media doing the bidding of the billionaire class. That was we were up against all of that, and the fact that we have won despite that, not only the progressive slate, which is incredibly important even, and it was important that we built towards this progressive unity. It's a really important demonstration of how progressive movements can have honest debates and discussions amongst ourselves, but it's also important for us to take a principled, unified stance against the billionaire class, which is exactly what we have been able to accomplish here. And I'm really proud of rank-and-file Democrats and the grassroots Democratic Party leaders and organizers taking a stand in solidarity with the socialist movement and working together. And, our movement wasn't just about, making an abstract statement against corporations. This whole battle has unfolded from the wake of the $15 victory. But as we went, we kept building our movement. We won landmark renters' rights. We won Indigenous Peoples Day. And what we won most of all is the beginning of the empowerment, the emboldening of ordinary people, of working class people, and the beginnings of a movement, an incredible movement that has started here, including with the leadership of my office, for rent control without loopholes, for a Green New Deal, for expanding publicly owned social housing.
We're going to talk about that program in part 2 of our discussion, which we're going to post online at democracynow.org, and also ask you about the news that Jeff Bezos called Michael Bloomberg, one billionaire to another, and asked him to jump in into the presidential race. We'll ask you all about that. The man who took the progressive council members on, richest man in the world, the head of Amazon, that poured $1.5 million in to defeat your slate. Kshama Sawant, Socialist City Council member in Seattle, just reelected for a third term. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Thanks so much for joining us.